This is our last day of Device Talks Boston 2019, so I'm glad you all could make it. Welcome. I'm delighted to introduce, if you haven't seen him before, Scott Whitaker, who's President and CEO of AdvaMed. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And let's just get right into it. So a longstanding policy goal, obviously, is repealing of the device tax. So let's just get that out of the way. How's it going? What's next? Where are we?
It's a never-ending issue for us, right? I say often when I'm on the Hill now, the good news is that the issue itself, the policy issue itself, is settled. No one thinks the device tax is good healthcare policy. No one thinks it's good tax policy. Now it's just a process and revenue question that we're dealing with in Congress. So we continue to work on it. As the Congress has changed, it's become a little more complicated again because as the Democrats took over the House, you have to begin a re-education of the Democrat side of the aisle and then try to grow the number of Democrats that support full repeal. And so we've spent the first half of this year on the re-education campaign. The second half of the year is going to be focused on trying to find a legislative vehicle to move some form of full repeal in if we can get there. But Brad, you and I were talking before, once Congress has revenue on its books, it's really hard to convince them to take that revenue off the books. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with right now, probably more than anything else. The most likely outcome, I would say, is that at the end of this year, which is the way Congress works now, we'll get some type of probably temporary extension of the current suspension. If we get lucky, or if we get a major tax bill that might move, we may get more than a couple years. I said to some folks at dinner last night, you never want to just continue to live on a 1-year, 2-year, 3-year suspension because it doesn't give you the certainty that you need when you're running a company to have that long-term investment. But it's probably the reality of what we're dealing with in the next couple of years. Eventually, though, I think it does go away entirely. And it will be a major relief for, obviously, our companies. But we're making progress. Congressman Neal, a local congressman, is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee now. So a lot of what we're doing is working with him and other members in the House to help them understand why it matters to local businesses, local companies in Massachusetts. So any help that you all can provide in making sure they're hearing the message will help us eventually get this thing off the books for good.
Do you think it's just going to be sort of infinite moratoria to the horizon?
I think that's the likely outcome. At some point, I'm pretty sure that they'll finally just get rid of it once and for all. The reality is you just have to wait for something that moves through Congress. If you've watched Congress closely enough, and hopefully most of you haven't, but if you watch them closely enough, you find they do 1 or 2 big things a year now. It's not like you have a series of meaningful pieces of legislation that pass and go to the president to be signed like you would see in your government books when you were in school, right? It just doesn't work that way anymore. What happens throughout the course of the year is they pass a whole series of political things, right? Everybody does their political thing. And then at the end of the year, they wrap up as much of a bipartisan agreement as they can find into some type of spending bill that they have to pass in order for the government to be continued to be funded, right? And that's the vehicle that usually takes device tax and other controversial items. There is the possibility, Brad, however, of a tax extenders bill moving before the end of the year. And these are all a whole series of tax provisions that need extended that are part of current law and companies are banking on. And the likelihood is something happens around that, probably as early as midsummer, more likely in the fall. If that vehicle moves, it's a natural tax vehicle for us to attach device tax to, and there's revenue provisions associated with that, and so that could carry a longer extension, and we're really hoping that moves. If that doesn't move, we'll be at the end of the year doing another 1 or 2 years, and back at it next year doing the same thing.
Also, another big topic, FDA, of course. We have a new commissioner, Norman Sharpless. What are your impressions of him so far, and what are you doing to sort of
He's
aid him?
he's a very capable guy, and obviously, if you don't know, Ned Sharpless is the director of NCI, so an oncologist doctor as well, the National Cancer Institute of NIH. Is a friend of Scott Gottlieb's. I think shares his vision for the FDA. Scott did a tremendous job, I thought, when he was there for his 2-year period of time. I think Dr. Sharpless, if he's in that job for the remainder of the term, will be very similar to Scott, right, in his philosophical approach to things. But the likelihood is that the search will end up, I would say, concluding at some point this year, and then a nominating process will go forward. So we may not end up with him in the job full time if someone else has identified a candidate internally that they want to put in. In the meantime, when you're an acting commissioner, right, you're just really in caretaker mode. And making sure that the trains are running on time, making sure that the vision of the previous commissioner is being carried out, making sure that, in our case, with Jeff Shuren and his leadership at the Device Center, that they're able to do their jobs. And I think Dr. Sharpless understands that role in the interim and is doing a very good job with that. We'll see how it shakes out and who becomes the commissioner for the rest of the term soon.
So what would you tell that commissioner of the future, your like top 5, this is what I'd like to see?
So a clear, transparent, and predictable process is the most important thing. That's 3 in 1, right? I didn't get to 5, but I think most of you all in the medtech industry would agree that over the course of the last 10 years, the FDA has got much better than it was, say, 10 years ago, slowly. And it's not always perfect. There are certainly problems that they have. There are certainly issues with regard to products that are going through the approval process. But it has gotten significantly better, primarily because Jeff Shuren, who runs the center, I think embraced about 5 or 6 years ago the fact that the industry and the government are partners in trying to get new technologies and cures to patients who need them. And he doesn't look at it the way that some have looked at it in the past, with a very controversial, combative approach. His philosophy and the way he's organized the FDA, the center under his leadership, CDRH, is to try to create a collaborative process so that we can have conversation and dialogue. We've had a few laws that have passed that help that, right? The last MDUFA law, the user fee legislation that passed, stipulated very clearly what the process needed to be in order for industry to continue to support through user fees the FDA. And in each one of those steps, it required clarity, transparency, and predictability to get your product approved as safe and effective, either in 510K or PMA, by the FDA. And when you're dealing with government agencies, that's what you need more than anything else. The worst possible outcome is a government agency that's your regulator that doesn't speak to you, right? And if they don't speak to you and you don't have communications, you don't know how to get a new technology approved, right? And I think that's what Dr. Shuren's done a really good job of. I will say in the future, there's more work to be done. The world is changing, as you all know very much, and Brad, we'll probably talk about it a little bit later in your questions, but you're not dealing with devices anymore that are just stents or insulin pumps or some of the traditional technologies that we've used in the past. The world is changing and getting much, much more complicated. And FDA and CMS, which we'll talk about as well, and private payers for that matter, need to get their head around the convergence of traditional IT and traditional medical technologies as they come together and find a pathway to approval and to patients, because that's the future.
Well, we were talking yesterday with VP of Achille Interactive, and they're developing a video game for ADHD.
Wow.
So the questions around how do you regulate that?
Right.
If they make one little change, does it affect the therapeutic effect? Do they need to file for new indication?
Right.
It's a whole new world for them.
Right. And I think the good news is Dr. Shuren understands that it's coming, and he's been anticipating that. I think of the type 1 diabetes space, or the insulin space primarily. The progress that FDA has made in understanding the connection between a traditional insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, and the connectivity that exists between those two, That's the future of treating kids and adults with type 1 and maybe type 2 diabetes as well. Though most type 2s aren't on insulin pumps. But he recognized that very, very early and set up a process at the FDA that essentially led to Medtronic's connected pump being approved, I think, in record time, well ahead of what they thought. Had he not recognized the value of that convergence, the better outcomes for patients as a result of the communication between the two technologies, it may not be approved today. But every time one of those new technologies gets approved, it sets a precedent for the next one that wants to come. And that's the way the innovation cycle works. And I think they've recognized that, and I hope it continues.
So that's a good point for us to get into a related topic, which is cybersecurity,
Right.
which I imagine is of great concern or ought to be to your membership.
It is, yeah. So, and that's a tough one, right? So we've set up a center for digital health, and in that center at AdvaMed, we're focused on issues of emerging technologies and cybersecurity. We came out a year or so ago with some general principles on how the government and how private sector entities needed to think about security issues with these new technologies. There's two components to it. There's the security aspect to make sure that your product can't get hacked and then can't get abused by someone who's trying to disrupt the healthcare system or disrupt a patient's treatment protocol. But then there's also the fear factor that we have to be very aware of as well, because if one of these events occurs and the media begins to spread alerts and alarms about it, and a government agency doesn't come in and settle people down, then people are going to become fearful of new technologies and connected devices and data in a way that they shouldn't, right? It's something that we all need to embrace because it's very clear that the more connected devices and the data associated with that really improves long-term outcomes of patients that are on these devices. And so those two components are what we're trying to better understand and manage. It goes back to what I said earlier about FDA and other government agencies. They need to understand and manage it very well as well. So a combination of conversations with government entities, the private sector, and the payer community to make sure that we're all on the same page around what cybersecurity means, how we can manage it, how we can control incidents where people allege a hacking. Those things are all very important to protect the future innovations that are coming.
So are there other sort of emerging regulatory issues that you're looking at closely?
Yeah, so there's a whole series of things. One of the things we've been focused on recently is in the communication side of the regulatory work. Making sure that when the FDA sees something, a signal of some type, a concern of some type, that communication, it comes back to the companies early so we can address it before it's a story in the media, right? And
I don't like to hear that.
what's that? Yeah, that's right. And I think that communication is really important to better outcomes as well, right? And so we've had a number of conversations with them about how we can communicate better and how we can understand incidents that they see, signals that they see, and we're dealing with that now. We're going to look at it also in terms of the next round of MEDUFA, which is coming up in a couple years, which we'll begin to negotiate the terms of that agreement. But that's one of the things that we're focused on going forward.
So another priority for you folks is kind of been a tough year, PR-wise. A lot of big headline, sort of very negative coverage of
Right.
our industry.
Right.
What's your sort of take on that, and how are you trying to address the public perception?
So it's unfortunate, but it's the reality that we're dealing with, right? For those of you who aren't familiar, I don't know if you saw the film The Bleeding Edge that Netflix did that took a really tough shot at the industry. It was followed by a global investigation of the medical device industry by a group called ICIJ. It's the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It's the group that did the Panama Papers a few years ago, if you're familiar with that. Got a Pulitzer Prize for it. They saw this issue and the bleeding edge and decided to target our industry and come after us. And we've been fighting on that front for 6 months now. In November of last year, they launched their series of stories after about 9 months of investigating. The good news was there was nothing particularly new about that. What they were essentially saying is the FDA regulatory process is inferior to what it needs to be, particularly in the 510K space. And as a result of that, unsafe products are getting to patients and in patients in a way they shouldn't, and there's been a great deal of patient harm, right? It makes for a very nice storyline. It makes for a lot of clicks. It makes for a good headline. But as you dig into the details of that, it's not nearly that simple. And that's the story we've been trying to counter as the ICIJ investigation goes forward. The reality is you can always find, when you're dealing with something as complicated as the human body and human suffering, you can always find an incident or two where a product didn't go as you initially planned, right? That's just the reality of dealing with human suffering and the human condition. But if you step back at it and you look at the numbers, the safety and effectiveness of the medical device products that are on the market right now is remarkable, right? 99.5% of the products that are out there don't have adverse events or anything negative associated with them. So we began to tell the story of the value of medical technology and medical devices to patients. The biggest concern I had is not the stories themselves. Those are fine. We deal with that. You deal with that with the media all the time. That's their job. It's our job to respond, and we're perfectly comfortable engaging in that battle. But there are two aspects of it that were concerning to me initially. One, you do not want patients to be afraid as a result of seeing a story about a product that allegedly didn't work as it was intended. Because that patient goes to the doctor and then begins to ask questions, well, why should I do that? And I told folks, I talked to a lot of reporters during this time, I said, remember something, right? We're not putting products in healthy patients. We're dealing with an underlying disease that we're trying to resolve, fix, or make more manageable for someone who's suffering, right? And as a result of that, if those patients aren't receiving our technologies, the suffering is going to be much worse. So as you're thinking about that, you have to take that into account as well. Fear often causes individuals not to use technology. We don't want individuals, patients, to be afraid of technology. We don't want them just relying on technology that's 20 years old because that's risk-free in their mind, when new technology can treat things in a much more effective way. So we feel like we've managed that to a place where it hasn't had a major negative impact on the industry. We have found, we've done a lot of polling since the ICIJ investigation started. The view of the industry remains very, very strong, not only domestically but globally as well. People understand the value of medical technology and value the technology in their lives and the lives of loved ones that have benefited from it. And so we've been pleased by that. I think the American people oftentimes are much smarter than people give them credit for, right? When you have a person in your family who's suffered, then you realize without that technology they might not be alive. It sort of changes your perspective on things. That's one aspect of it, and I feel good about that. The second part that has always concerned me is if the stories and the investigations lead to congressional investigation and congressional action that in some way could negatively impact the FDA regulatory process as it currently exists. And the reality is, in our conversations on the Hill, members of Congress understand this too, right? They listen, they take the stories seriously, they understand the harm that can be caused if a process doesn't go according to plan, but they also have understood the value of the current system as it is now, the value of technology to patients, and the importance of keeping and sustaining that. And so we have not seen an attempt by anyone in Congress to really go after the industry, to reframe or recast how you regulate either 510K products or PMA products. And so as a result of that, we feel good about where we are. But you have to stay vigilant on this, right? It's an ongoing issue. Every few weeks another story pops up. Oftentimes it's a retread of stories that ran in the past. John Oliver did a bit on it recently, if you saw that. But it was the same kind of conversation about pick a product and pick a patient and somebody who had a negative outcome, and then cast a view of the industry that's negative across all aspects of it is sort of the way they do it. But I think a lot of people see through that. And but we need to stay vigilant with this, as I said earlier, and stay very connected to the stories to make sure that the American people, that the population globally understands the industry well.
How do you think the FDA's response to that?
They've been good. And I mentioned his name earlier, but I give Dr. Shuren a lot of credit. I think not only does he understand the FDA process that they currently follow, he's also been very clear in articulating that it's the best process that exists right now. And that's been very helpful. And it's not at our direction, to be clear, right? I think it's what he actually feels. There is a concern, a longer-term concern, that if the momentum continues to build around this, at some point the FDA will feel the public pressure and need to make adjustments. But the good news is, a year in, we haven't seen that from them yet. You've seen a few tweaks here and there to the 510K process, primarily around this notion of the predicate and how old a predicate can be and using it to approve a new product. But that was actually a fairly reasonable approach, I thought, that they took. The only concern about that was they set a bit of a random number, 10 years, right? If it's 10 years or newer, it's fine. If it's 10 years or older, it's not. That's not necessarily a magic number, and we've had a lot of conversations with them about that. But as a general rule, Brad, I think they've handled it well, and I think we all benefit from them handling it well, not on behalf of the industry necessarily, but behalf of the patients who need these new innovative technologies.
What about the criticism that, especially with 510K, it's really not suited for things that are implantable or for things where the components are all 510K, but together they probably shouldn't be?
Right.
How do you respond to those criticisms?
So they say that, and then they also say that our process needs to look more like the pharma process as well, with extensive clinical trials for every 510K product that exists right now. I respond to it by saying this is a complicated industry. It's not as similar to pharma and pharmaceutical products as people want to believe. If you look at the 510K process, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3 devices, and then the PMA process on top of that, it's set up that way for a reason, right? Because the diversity of products in the medical technology space is huge. And you can't regulate all of them under the same paradigm, or new innovative technologies won't get to patients, right? You need these categories and differentiation between one product category and another product category in the same 510K space. Now, I will say, admittedly, that as technology changes and evolves, we have to keep looking at the 510K process to make sure it still works for every category, and we're fine with that because it's in everyone's interest, and no one more so than us and the companies that we represent, that the 510K process, the PMA process, and broadly the FDA review process is sound, scientific, and has the confidence of the American people, right? And so we're fully supportive of continuing to review that, and we do it on an annual basis with the FDA. We do it every 5 years with major overhauls to the user fee law that exists and the regulatory structure. So we'll do that, but I caution people, let's not overreact to one story and one incident and then overhaul a system that's worked, incredibly well. In fact, it's the gold standard across the world, I think, right now. And so there's a lot of work to be done in an evolving technology sector like ours.
Right. So let's turn to the other 500-pound gorilla in the room, which is reimbursement,
Yeah.
and changes to the process at CMS. Can you give us an update and talk about why this has become so increasingly important?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the progress we made at FDA. I've been at AdvaMed for 3.5 years, going on 4 now. And I've seen the progress at FDA since I've been there. I use the phrase transparent process, a clear process, a predictable process. All of those things at FDA have improved. None of those things have improved really at CMS. I think the current administration, to their credit, the current administrator, to her credit, understands that it's not where it needs to be and is committing to try to fix it. They've had a number of changes in the past year to the local coverage decision process that frankly is much better than it was before. So they're listening, they're understanding, but we still have a long way to go at CMS. And what I hear from most of our companies is the FDA is no longer the problem that it was 5 or 10 years ago, but that CMS and private payers continue to be the challenge that most of our companies deal with. You get through the FDA and then you go, where do we go from here? Right? That's the big question you ask, because at some point you have to pay for those products. It has to get into the system so that patients can see the value. And there's a lack of understanding about what that process is for every product that goes through, and that's what we need to clarify. We're working on 2 specific policy proposals right now with CMS, understanding their limits to how quickly they can overhaul things. But one of them is what we call breakthrough pathways. So we had introduced legislation a couple years ago that would essentially say once a product has been approved by the FDA as a breakthrough technology, which means there's a clinical need for it, that it's a new and novel technology, they speed the process to get it to market as a result of meeting that technology pathway, that CMS should just immediately cover it, right? And if they need to build evidence over the course of a period of 2 to 3 years to understand what the long-term reimbursement rate needs to be for that product, that's fine. And we'll fully engage with them in the evidence development process to get there. But for a period of 3 years, just give it a temporary code, right? Let us get into the system. Let patients experience it. Let the Medicare system understand it. Rather than what often happens now is FDA approves a breakthrough product, CMS sits on it for 12 to 18 months, and you don't know what's going to happen with it, and you're continuing to try to raise money, and you're continuing to try to keep your company afloat, and you're continuing to try to sell that technology. And then you're also fighting the battle with CMS over what the reimbursement's going to look like. We have made progress, and I think in the next few weeks, maybe the next couple of months, we're going to have something out of the administration on that. I'm not sure it'll be exactly what we want, but I think it's going to be a step in the right direction toward a more progressive approach to covering breakthrough technologies. The second category we're working on of products is those that aren't necessarily breakthrough products, but they're new and novel technologies where there's an unmet need or a value to the system that might not be obvious to everyone. And we've said to CMS a similar thing, right? Let this product get into the system, maybe not with a temporary code for the entire Medicare population, but cover the clinical trials associated with that, or the evidence development process, I should say, associated with that inside the Medicare program. Give it a code so we can get that to the Medicare population, and then we'll build the evidence on the value of that long term so that after a year or 2 years it's in the system permanently, or as long as the value exists. And they've also been forward-leaning on that, and so we've had very good conversations. I think it won't fix everything at CMS, but if we can get those two policies advanced, that'll go a long way. The last thing I'll say is there's a cultural issue that you just have to deal with inside agencies. FDA has moved, I think the culture of FDA had moved to a partnership, I think, with industry in many ways. CMS still has what I describe as a budget-centric approach to every decision that they make, as opposed to a patient-centric approach to the decisions that they make. They're primarily motivated by how much does it cost and whether or not they believe there's value to it, right? And the value isn't the value to the patient necessarily, it's the value to the Medicare system from a cost standpoint. What we've been trying to say is the culture has to change because there's a patient component to this as well. You need to have a budget-centric approach, yes. We understand there's a cost associated with that, but what about the patients that need it, right? How do you factor that into the approval process? And how do you factor that in the reimbursement process at the end of the day? A great example, Brad, is in the insulin space, where you've had companies that come up with new technologies for the delivery of insulin in type 1 diabetics, who will be on that technology until they get to the Medicare program. Medicare won't cover it. It's been covered by private insurers, and then they're dropped, and then they have to switch technologies, right? That's just not a good way to do business. And as we've been telling those stories and educating CMS, they're starting to evolve to a place, I think, that's better.
So today is the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and I wanted to recognize that and ask you what role Medtech can play in getting veterans into the medical device industry.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a humbling day, right? I was flipped on the TV this morning. I was watching some of the D-Day ceremonies in Normandy. Powerful. The president gave a very good address, as did President Macron today as well, about what occurred during that period of time and the valor and the strength of the men who fought those battles. There was a lot of reflection afterwards that those were the good days and we don't have those type of people anymore. That's certainly true, amazing men, but we also have today amazing people who serve in the military and spend 2 years, 4 years, 6 years or beyond doing great things to make our country a better place to live and protect freedom. And I often say that they're the best kind of people to attract into the medtech industry. We have a partnership with MVP Vets. Jason is here, I think, the CEO of MVP Vets, Jason Gilberte. Where's Jason? I thought I saw him earlier. There he is. And we have a partnership with MVP Vets. And if you haven't met Jason, make your way over and say hi to him. Where we're trying to create opportunities for veterans to come into the medtech industry and find jobs in the medtech industry. This is a mission-based industry as much as anything else. And as you know from the great people who have served in our military, those are mission-based people, right, who have a passion for something, they care about something, they're trying to change people's lives, they're trying to do good, all the things I think that we represent as an industry. And it's a perfect match, right? And so we've been working with Jason and his team to give opportunities for vets to get insights into what we do in this industry, give us an opportunity to recruit and attract former vets and bring them into the industry because they make a huge difference. I will say on my board, which is CEOs of all the major medtech companies, we have a number of CEOs that are former military, West Point grads who have done amazing things since they've come back from their service overseas. And I'm really proud of them, and we want to do all we can to help the veteran community.
Excellent. Well, I think we have some time for some questions from the audience. If anyone has questions for Scott.
I was born in Taiwan. I came to this country 40 years ago, and I went to WPI. And lately, we invest in Taiwan, and we found out the medical insurance. Like we pay $1,000 every month in this country. But in Taiwan, my brothers pay $30 every month. They enjoy everything in terms of the quality and coverage. This is what I couldn't figure out, 1,000 versus $30. And Taiwan is similar as here, medical and technology island. Can you give a little bit, are you aware of that $30? The quality and coverage are excellent.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with those numbers exactly, and be happy to talk to you about it further. Our system is a different system than many healthcare systems around the world. In many ways, it's more complicated than other systems around the world. Not perfect, right? But one of the things it does really well, I believe, is that it incentivizes innovation, and it has done that effectively in the United States because of the way the system works. My concern has always been if the healthcare system shifts in a way that it is entirely government-run or more socialized in its scope, that it could have a negative impact on innovation in the system. I think of Medicare and the way it works right now. It's a great program. I spent 4 years as chief of staff at HHS and oversaw the work of CMS, the group that runs the Medicare program. It's a wonderful program for seniors, right? And we could never do away with that. But the reality is, I'm not sure that system would work perfectly if you put it on the entire country, right? And so while to some degree our system seems like a patchwork system where it's not equal and not everybody has access and we need to get to the place where everybody has access, it does have the value of incentivizing innovation in a way that you often don't see in other parts of the world. And I think as we're thinking about healthcare reform, it's important that you balance those two things. How can we make sure that it's more affordable and more accessible to everyone, while also continuing to incentivize the innovation that currently exists in this country? If you think about medtech and the medical device industry, that's a uniquely American industry, right? Not that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but most of the innovation has historically come from the U.S. and from our system, right? And those two things are really important to balance.
Another question for Scott? Over there.
Straight back.
I appreciate you touching on the PR crisis. I feel like as members of industry, we have all felt the pain of that, especially over the past year.
Yeah.
I do feel like our industry is harmed by not acknowledging that there have been some bad behaviors.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if there's been consideration by AdvaMed to, updating and expanding the code of ethics or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Data transparency in particular being a concern of mine.
Yeah. So we clearly haven't done a good enough job if you haven't heard. But at the end of last year, we did update the code of ethics, and we rolled it out this year. We should have rolled it out more extensively so you saw it. But we do it every few years, and it is important. I was in Brazil recently and visiting down there. They've got a lot of issues with corruption and challenges in that country as well. And I spent some time talking about our code of ethics and the value that has brought to the system more globally. And that is critically important. So I also agree with you. I don't ever want to suggest that there haven't been problems or mistakes, right, that have been made. But let's be honest about that too, right? They're not that many compared to the value of what the technologies bring to patients as well, right? And so rather than focus on the incident where there's harm and then overhaul a system that has worked quite well, let's focus on the incidents of harm and how we can make sure that doesn't happen again, right? That problem doesn't occur again, as opposed to changing the system for the 99% that work perfectly well, right? And that's part of the message too. I think you're right? You have to acknowledge there are problems that have occurred with products and with the system. The other thing I would say, and I say this with all due respect to everyone in the medical system, we're all connected, right? But it's not always the device that was the problem, right? There could have been other complicating factors that occurred in the process of a surgery or hospitalization or other underlying healthcare conditions that we didn't fully understand when the product was put into a patient, right? So we just need to understand how complex it is. I said this earlier, when you're dealing with the condition of human suffering, we have complicated bodies, right? It's not always going to go perfectly. And frankly, if you look at how complicated our bodies are, how difficult suffering has been, the progress that we've made in saving lives and changing lives has been really remarkable, right? And that side of the story, I think, often doesn't get told enough. So.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I have two questions. The first one is more a reaction to what you just said before regarding the balance between how to change the healthcare system in the US to make it more affordable and to have every citizen to have access to it, but to keep a good level of innovation. So here I would like to react. So as you can tell, I'm not from the US. Do you think that having a system like the one you have now, where not everyone can afford the real innovation that arrive in this country, would lead to pharma companies or a medtech device company to not arrive to the US? So first part of the question.
You want me to answer that first, or you want to
Yes.
ask the second one?
Yeah.
So I think I don't know the answer to your question with a lot of clarity, right? Because it's projecting, I think, out to some degree on what is unknown, right? Which is a hard thing to do. What I often say is that we just need to make sure that whenever we change the healthcare system, that we're protecting the innovation structure that currently exists, right? And sometimes that can be abused, right, by companies that charge too much, or they aren't aware of the importance of a fair profit when you're dealing in a free enterprise system, right? All those things need to be factored in. And as I said earlier, as you're overhauling the healthcare system, we need to make sure that everybody has access to some form of healthcare or some form of the healthcare system. But in our country, as opposed to other countries that folks like to compare us with, right, we have 350 million people in this country right now, a very complicated and diverse citizen base. And you compare that to a country that may have 50 million people, that's a very different healthcare system, right? And so we need to continue to improve it, but my personal view is we don't need to overhaul it completely. And if you do, you're going to create some harm. I'll say this. I didn't think the ACA was nearly as bad as Republicans said it was, and it probably wasn't as good as the Democrats thought it was. But the reality is more people have access to the healthcare system as a result of ACA, and that's a good thing, right? So we should all celebrate that and then continue to make this current system as good as we can so that more people have access to it. What's not good is when you're passing a bill like ACA to put a tax like the device tax as a part of it that harms an industry that's trying to innovate, right? That's what harm can be done. But if we can get individuals more access to the healthcare system, then we should do it, and we should make sure that we're, as an industry, helping ensure that is the case. So, second question.
Yeah. Thank you. It's quite clear. Maybe I come after to ask. And the second question is more regarding the beginning of your talk on the regulation, the FDA regulation on device. And currently in Europe, they are revising the whole regulation,
Right.
the CE mark. And I was wondering how this might affect the way it's working at the FDA. Would you also change regarding the new legislation in Europe? And that's it. Thank you.
So I would say this. I think what Europe is trying to do is move to a more FDA-type regulatory structure, right? So I don't think it's going to have an impact on the FDA, regardless of what happens in Europe. The concern that I have is I'm not sure Europe's ready to meet the 2020 implementation date of the new regulations, right? And that's going to be a major problem if the European bodies are not fully ready to regulate in a new manner. So they have to make some adjustments, right? Either to delay the implementation or create some type of provisions inside the regulatory structure that grandfather existing products. Because if you have a product that's in the market now that has a CE mark that might not have gone through the regulatory system but is in the marketplace, they come up with a new regulatory paradigm in the EU. You have to then go back through that entire process in order to get back into the market. That's going to be incredibly disruptive, right? And so through our sister organization, Medtech Europe, we've been trying to tell that story. But I am concerned about the implementation date of 2020. It's not that far away. And candidly, I'm not sure they're ready for it. And so we've been talking about that and working with them. So the concern for me is in Europe, I don't think that has any impact on the FDA and the regulatory system that we're operating under here now.
Are you worried at all about Brexit and its effect on your members?
Yeah, yes. Very unpredictable to know what the impact will be, obviously, right? They can't seem to sort it out themselves. I think I try to take the optimistic view on things as best we can. If Brexit does fully occur, I think there's an opportunity for us to deal directly with the UK and their regulatory system. Maybe there's a way to have an agreement between the FDA and the UK to create a system that works for both of us. There's opportunities, I think, with trade partnerships that could exist as well. So yes, it's concerning because it's disruptive.
Right.
But perhaps, regardless of what they do, we have to deal with the reality of it. Perhaps if that reality is they do break away, then we can create a system there that works for our companies.
We have another question here. We'll go 1, 2, 3.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
This is very informative. My company is going through the device approval FDA starting this month, which prompts a question. I already had experience 10 years ago with an IND Alzheimer's drug pharmaceutical, so
Right.
I know how complicated and difficult it is. With the device procedure, I'm finding extreme differences in which division and their response and how smooth it is or is not going. Is there informal data on success and which divisions to help guide? I have a multiple use device.
Okay. Combination device? Or?
Combination.
Yeah. So yes, we have some information on that. I don't know how instructive it will be in your current case, but let me give you a name of someone who works for me, Janet Trunzo, who runs our regulatory program for AdvaMed and has been doing it, Executive Vice President for Regulatory Affairs, has been doing it for me for a long time at AdvaMed, can give you great advice. It's a question we often get, right? When you're going into the FDA, what pathway should I attempt to choose, assuming the FDA lets you choose that pathway? And some of the data that you've seen from other products that might be similar can be instructive, right? And so whatever she has, I'm sure she would be happy to share with you. I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, though. Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead. Another couple questions? We'll go. Oh.
Right, thank you. So you commented already that the medical device regulation is probably not going to affect the FDA, but what about the convergence of 13485 and Part 820? Is there legislative implications or procedural implications?
What,
This is the FDA essentially saying
you
we
lost
want
me
to
on the
be.
numbers, sorry.
Oh, sorry. The FDA essentially wanting to be more aligned to the global design
Oh,
control
right,
standard
right.
1345.
Yeah, so the FDA can lead that process to a better place, and I think they're trying to do it. It's hard to pull these countries all to the place where we need them to be, right? So I think that's sort of the reverse of what I was saying earlier. I don't think the European process is going to have a negative implication on the FDA, but the FDA, on the other hand, can have a positive impact on the other regulatory processes around the world if they are willing to cooperate in that. And much of that cooperation, one, it's resource intensive, right, for us to do that. And secondly, the other countries and the other regulatory systems have to be willing to embrace that. So IMDRF is a system that's been set up to deal with some of these international global harmonization areas, and particularly in South and Central America, we've seen some improvement in the regulatory system as a result of that collaboration in Brazil and Colombia and in Mexico as well. And so we need to continue to work on that. But in FDA's defense, it's a lot of work to pull everyone along.
I think we have time for one more. We'll finally get to you.
Good morning, Scott. Thank you for being here. Really enjoyed the talk. Can you comment on the recent activity on ETO and ETO
Yeah.
sterilization, and some of the site closures that we've seen, the constraints in the market, and what AdvaMed's
Right.
activity has been on that front?
So there are two components to this. For those of you who aren't familiar with the ETO issue, there was an incident in Illinois with a facility outside of Chicago in Willowbrook where there was allegations of elevated levels of ethylene oxide in the air, and as a result of that, individuals who claimed cancer-causing agents had caused their disease, right, from that plant specifically. The Illinois EPA acted to shut that plant down so they could further inspect how much of the EO was in the atmosphere and whether or not that was actually the cause of it. That plant continues to be shut down, and the Illinois Legislature has taken action to keep it closed and create a process for reopening that is rather complicated. And so in Illinois, that's where we are today, right? So that's one issue. That's a fairly manageable issue to one particular facility. Other facilities in Illinois may be impacted by this as well. There are two others that are being talked about in the context of emissions from the ETO sterilization plants, and so we're focused on that. The bigger issue is what is the US EPA going to do about this? And it appears right now, well, I should say, there's some certainty that there's going to be a new rule that comes out of US EPA in the next month, maybe 2 months, with a public comment period. We've been very engaged with them to help them understand how much of the medical system is currently reliant on EO as a sterilization tool to get safe products to patients. They seem to understand that. There's also two components of it. One of it is the emissions component, right? How do you control the flow of ETO outside of that facility to make sure that there isn't harm to the community? And then the longer term issue, I think, is are there other new technologies that are emerging that would be better technologies for sterilization and not have the potential of public health harm associated with them? So our conversation has been in both fronts, right? Protecting ETO as it currently exists because it's a critical component of sterilizing products, and then looking at future technologies as well and looking at what can be done in the future. So right now, I feel like the EPA is trending in a direction where we'll be less stringent than what the Illinois EPA has done, and I think set a broad set of standards that the industry can meet without major overhauls to the current system that we live under right now. I hope that's where we land. It's critically important. For anything like this, it's a great example of how the public sentiment spun out of control in Illinois, and a lot of misinformation was passed on as a result of that. We want to make sure that that is limited and controlled to that one facility in that one area so it doesn't spread across the country. If it does, the negative consequences to public health are severe in the short term. And I think that's the primary case we need to make to FDA and to EPA, though it's primarily an EPA issue. We're just looking to FDA to sort of support our argument. And I think in the next month or so, we'll see a rule out of EPA that will be manageable.
With that, thank you, Scott. It's been a
good.
pleasure. I really appreciate you
Good.
taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you all.